newspapers and from local radio stations. And a talk like that at a branch meeting of an NUJ, whether it be in Ballinasloe or Ballygob or wherever it is, I think that would be very, very important. Also, if you hear something bad on the radio station, whether it's a local radio or in the newspapers, whether you're allowed to do it, and this comes into the big problem of if you're allowed to do it from a health service perspective, but if you're speaking obviously from a P&A perspective, ring up the national stations, ring up the radio stations about coverage to complain. There was a few years ago, the man locked up in the house in Gort, and the Sun the next day had the front page nutter. And we went on the radio and criticised the reporter and the report. He subsequently resigned from the NUJ, and we got an issue raised about how this should be covered. And it was only by that direct intervention that you can raise these issues. So that's something I think that could be done a lot more. And if it's done by members of the P&A locally, I think that could have a big, big effect. There is a genuine desire on the part of many of our members to learn more about our responsibilities in covering the issues of suicide. One of the areas that I think requires careful considerations is instances of suicide preceded by murder. Recent coverage of multiple murders followed by suicide has been disturbing. Media organisations, I think, they must accept the extreme nature of an incident. And this extreme nature doesn't imply in itself permission to ignore codes or guidelines. But it's when these high-profile cases occur, it's sometimes then that's the best time to get your message across. And it can be very, very difficult, obviously, picking out these extreme cases, whether, again, it be something like Clonroach or Monageer, and then people generalising from these very specific and very sad cases. A lot of you know that copycat suicides account for approximately 6% of suicides. Although it may not seem a lot, if journalists are aware that they could be playing their part in the deaths of over 30 people every year, they might be more careful in how they write or report on a suicide. Research shows that written media such as newspapers, magazines and websites are more likely to provoke imitation suicides than the broadcast media. And it seems to me probably because a person can look at, absorb, revisit the story an awful lot more in the printed media. The growing influence, obviously, of the internet on issues such as suicide is something which traditional news editors and media owners haven't really paid much attention to. And in fact, if a website is reported to be used by teenagers to chat about suicide plans, what chance is there that the website owner then will try to increase advertising on it because there's greater hits on it? Something like that might entail a lot of research and, again, a lot of criticism for something like that. For journalists and for editors, suicide presents a dilemma. We have a policy in RTE over the years of not reporting on suicides, and so too does the Irish Times. There's a coded language used, such as a man's body was recovered from the water or whatever, and foul play was not suspected. There are times, though, I would argue that suicide can be an issue of public interest, and you have to ask then, is it the responsibility of a reporter to convey this news every time? There may be a positive aspect to reporting suicide. It may help destigmatise the subject. Film and TV drama, for example, similar quandaries exist. The media and those working in the media, we do carry an enormous responsibility to deal with certain issues, and we should deal with them in a thoughtful and a sensitive way. Again, sometimes when there's deadlines, when there's news editors screaming at you, when there's pressure from other newspapers to get the story or pretend to get the story, some journalists do make up stuff. They write lies. They won't say it's lies, they'll say they've heard it from a source. That source mightn't be a real source, they've actually just made it up. It does happen. There was a couple of specific instances, and I wrote to the Irish Times about it at the time after the Clonroach tragedy with the Flood family, that the Mail and the Mirror, and I think the Sun as well, again I'm not being haughty-taughty by just mentioning those, there was actually untruths written in those papers. And again, I was accused by the Mirror afterwards of being deranged for even suggesting this type of thing, that God, a journalist would never, ever make up stuff like that. They do make it up, and a lot of times they make it up because of pressures, but also in a vacuum that exists because they're not getting information from trained professionals like yourselves. Again, it's something that would be great if the press officer or local branch officer of the P&A was able to ring up a reporter or the reporters if they're covering a major tragedy like that and say, listen, our take on this would be, and whatever. Not necessarily giving an interview, but giving some sort of a context to how this might have occurred. Again, you've got the problem of dealing with privacy and all that sort of issue. But if there's some guidance given to journalists, a lot of times journalists are very lazy. They're very childish in how they do their work. They basically don't research their material properly, and that also has to be taken into account. Now, it's the nature of the environment in which we work that we can sometimes also be numbed to the desperate circumstances in which people find themselves and the implications the language we use can have on those affected. Now, we're committed in the NUJ to the highest professional and ethical reporting standards. It's the core of our code of conduct. Studies show that media portrayals of people with mental health problems, for example, are seen as negative by 44% of Scottish people. That was a recent study. A major study of coverage in Australian newspapers found that rates of male suicide increased following reports of a suicide, peaking on the third day after the suicide story appeared. Studies in Britain show that reporting suicide as a tragic waste and as an avoidable loss, which has a devastating impact on others, can actually help reduce suicide rates. So it's how the reporting is done can also have a big effect. A lot that's spoken about in journalism is the language, obviously, we use. Even more so when dealing with pressing deadlines. No intelligent, responsible journalist should ever use words like loony, nutter, madman, schizo or bonkers to describe someone with a mental health problem. No sub-editor or editor should either use those type of words. Again, a lot of those words have come into common usage from Britain and they're appearing now in Ireland. I'm not just saying that it's cross-fertilisation from that, but a lot of it for very specific political and economic reasons. A lot of the editors that work sub-editing the newspapers in Ireland are actually based in England. So if a journalist will do the story for the Mail, for the Mirror, whatever, he'll type it up. It might then be sent over by computer and it might be put together on a page in England. It might be done in Dublin. You just don't know. There are issues there that the journalist is maybe removed from the story, and to fit a headline on a page, a sub-editor will think he or she is clever by using certain words which are totally inappropriate. We should also be aware there are more subtle ways of discriminating against people with mental health problems. We should always say someone, for example, was discharged from hospital, a psychiatric or not, never released. Journalists, again, fall into that. They don't do that all the time. Now, a civilised society shouldn't punish people for being mentally distressed, as we know. So when someone, in those rare instances when a mental health problem commits a crime, it's important to recognise that illness may have played a major part in the offence, but we just don't know. We should never put ourselves up as trained psychiatrists to the public at large. We should tell them we're only just reporters. In general, some sections of the media tend to link violent crime and mental health problems too much. The facts, they actually show otherwise. And this type of bad reporting, again, misleads and reinforces stigmas. A few examples of the effects the media portrayals on suicide. A German television series in the past, Death of a Student, depicted a railway suicide of a young man at the start of each episode. Railway suicides in Germany went up 175%. There was a famous episode of the BBC Casualty in which a storyline about a paracetamol overdose. Self-poisoning increased in the UK that week 17% and 9% in the second week. 1/5 of those patients who had seen the programme said it influenced their decision. A positive aspect of that is that the law was subsequently changed to prevent people from buying large numbers of such tablets. So there was a positive aspect at the end of all that, but a very painful process for the BBC at the time. Finally, research shows that guidelines tend to be ignored by approximately 20% of the print media on this topic. So no matter how good the guidelines are, still 20% of people will ignore the topics, will ignore the guidelines. I'd suggest it's probably more in some National Sunday broadsheets, also in the tabloids. In general, the media tends to focus on personal and medical reasons for suicide and ignores the wider issues of profound social change because it's just not sexy. It's just not, like, how do you talk about stuff like that? That sort of doesn't fit into the newspaper columns or whatever. A few very specific